Professor Prabhu, thank you so much for speaking to us at DeKoder. This is Between Us. I've been going through your wonderful book, Lean Spark. I wanted to know, it's a very hopeful book, actually. It's all about what's doing well and those who made it. So before I put on my cynical hat, I wanted to know, what went into selecting the stories and the people that you've selected?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think it reflects the fact that we are, and I'll speak for myself in particular, sort of perennial optimists, trying to look on the bright side of life where things are working. And quite a few things are working in India at the moment, for India, especially if you look around the world. The things that inspire me and my co-authors as well are people who have tried to do something that's difficult and against the odds have succeeded, often over a long period of time. So the inspiration comes from people like that, whether they are entrepreneurs operating in the for-profit arena, or people working in larger corporations, or people in government, people in various sectors, including education and so on. So that's where the sort of inspiration and the material comes from.
But, as I was going through all the stories, I kind of felt, and I could be completely wrong, that they're largely well-known.
Yeah.
So was that an aspect, or sort of did you think that, okay, these are easier stories to tell and sort of not go into something that's more buried, or...
Well, I think there's a trade-off, so you want to sort of look at examples that have been around long enough that we know exactly why they worked and or why they didn't work. And also because the focus of the book is so much on scale, you have to wait for long enough for that to happen. Right. So I think that's probably why the examples are well known. And then you want the readers also to be able to relate to it, and you don't want things that are really obscure. And of course, if they were really obscure, even we might not have found out about them. So I think maybe that's why they are familiar to many people.
Okay, fair. There was a wonderful line where when you're speaking about Rahat and Quidditch, and Quidditch from Harry Potter, and you said that spirit stayed with Rahat and Quidditch ever since. Time and again, they would say yes and then figure it out later. I thought that's very interesting because, with my old boss, Prannoy Roy, or even with the board founder, I always thought the one thing was that say yes, and we'll figure it out later, right? Yeah. But is this sort of that 1% to the 100% that doesn't work out?
I think so that you're right in pointing out that, these are mostly the positive stories, the optimistic stories, the ones that have worked. And again, it's because we want to understand how things scale. And so many of these are examples of organizations that have scaled. Now, that particular quote suggests the Jugaad part of the book. But then in that chapter, we go into how you go from Jugaad to scale. And so that was a pattern that when we were interviewing all the various cases, we wanted to understand how you go from improvisation to something far more systemic and something that will last longer and that can be replicated. So that was something we really wanted to get at. How do you go from that, trying to wing it, because that will only go so far, to something that is replicable. And so that's something we got into with Rahat as well in the course of that chapter.
So you do speak about it in the book, sort of in different chapters. But if you were to tell our viewers, what was that one defining or two defining traits that you found in every founder that you spoke to who'd kind of made it?
Yeah, great question. And I think one is that vision, that from the beginning itself, you have certain principles in mind. So that's also a distinction that we're trying to make between Jugaad and Lean Spark. That in Jugaad is improvisational, perhaps more short term. It may be a quick fix. It might remain local. Whereas this term we've created, Lean Spark, is intended to capture the fact that yes, you may have some of that frugality that Jugaad has, but from the very beginning, you have this vision of, say, for instance, wanting to provide an ID for 1.4 billion people, right? You have that vision of scale. And then linked to that, you have this vision of affordability, because the only way you'll be able to scale, get to that scale, especially in a country like India, is if it's affordable and so on. So there is something about the intentionality there, and having that vision and being willing to see it play out over a long period of time and persevering. I think those are the elements that are quite distinctive to the people who have succeeded at this kind of game.
So Lean Spark, as the book is called, you've just explained it, but tell me what went into calling it Lean Spark. I mean, is it literal?
So here, perhaps, we should ask my co-authors, because this is a joint effort, and various of the three of us, we came up with different aspects of the book, including the title. And this is really Mukesh and Priyank who I think have something to do with it. Of course, I was involved. I think it plays on this idea of the lean startup. So that has been very influential to us. It's also been very influential more generally in the world of entrepreneurship. It's about this approach to lean execution, which is a key principle in Lean Spark. Then I think it also plays on their previous book, which is called Leapfrog. So there's an element of almost rhyming there. And also this idea of a spark, there's something about ingenuity. And I think that's another trait, by the way, it's ingenuity. How constraints, the lack of resources, actually inspire creativity and create that spark for something ingenious. So these are some of the associations.
Having said that, and if I remember correctly, there's a bit where you say one of the founders, and I forget her name, but they say that how it's all very well to speak about, frugality and constraints, but there is something to be said about lack of capital.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting because, how much can you then scale or go? And so speak to us a little about that.
And I think you may be referring to Chetan Mehdi, who of the Reva, then Reva Mahindra, and then Sun Mobility and so on. And this is the paradox. So, there are paradoxes in all this. So frugality, in a sense, yes, as I said, constraints can inspire creativity, but sometimes, it can go too far, right? So I think often in the early stages of coming up with something, frugality can be your friend. But then in the scaling part, you clearly need some resources. And those resources could be capital, but it could be other forms of resources. It could be time, for instance, could be partnerships, could be reputational assets, things like that. Now, even there, though, again, it's a matter of scale. So even there, the question is how much capital? And I think in the Indian context, what many Indian startups that have scaled show is that there is a different model from the Silicon Valley model, where you throw money at things and you hope that 1 out of 10 works. And it's the money that helps you scale. I think in the Indian context, we don't have that kind of capital. In most countries around the world, you don't have that kind of capital to scale. You need capital, but you don't have a lot of it. So even there, you have to think smart. And you have to think, how can you make the best use of that relatively limited capital? So it's a relative idea.
So again, but I want to go back to that bit because, again, one of the things I felt was that, through the book, the founders speak of challenges, etc. But I thought in your conversations, which are perhaps not in the book, was there any, because when you think of startups and everything, there's a massive disconnect between the founder and the money guy. And is that sort of currently in India or even globally sort of restricting people?
Well, I think the dominant model is the venture capital model, and their whole model is it's a risk return one. So we'll throw money at 10. And we expect 9 out of 10 to fail, and 1 will succeed, and it'll succeed so spectacularly.
Big, the 9 make up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's the model that we want to challenge, because I think that is built on a particular narrative, which is the Silicon Valley narrative, and perhaps that really only works in that context, and whereas I think in the Indian context, because of the relative lack of capital, just as one resource, people have to think much more cleverly about their use of resources, not just in the early phase, but also the scaling phase. And this goes back to the point about vision. So you have to know that if that's where I want to get to in whatever, 5 years, 3 years, or whatever, I can't just buy my way there. I have to think in a smarter way. For instance, I've got to make sure that this is something people really want and need, and so design it in such a way. So I think that is the distinction here. That is a uniquely, I think, emerging market phenomenon, and India is really, I think, in that context, at the forefront of that kind of thinking. But you see similar approaches in, say, China, although China is richer, or in Brazil and places, African economies and so on, or Eastern Europe.
So, speaking of China, there's a very interesting bit where you spoke about China and the lessons for India from DeepSeek's success.
Yeah.
So, would you like to, because DeepSeek is, I'm presuming, now fairly well known.
Yes.
Would you like to speak to our viewers about that?
Yeah, so DeepSeek is a very interesting example. It is an example of what we might call Chinese Lean Spark or Chinese Jugaad.
Because they built it to, contest your chat GPTs and sort of,
So it is a Chinese high-tech Jugaad. And why is it so? Well, they faced resource constraints. In that case, it was the fact that they didn't have access to these high-end GPUs because of the American sanctions. And so they had to think differently. So they didn't have access to one scarce resource, which was the GPUs. So they focused on, the software rather than the hardware. And they turned to a resource that they do have, which is talent. And of course, they do also have capital, perhaps not to necessarily the same extent in the US, but they do have a lot of capital. So that's, to me, a kind of Jugaad approach. You sort of think left field. Can we approach it from a different angle? And they actually had to think smarter. And in fact, they did come up with something that was far smarter and far more efficient. So I think that's a very good example.
But do you think that the difference between China and India in that sense also is that, I'm not saying state sanction, but that there is a lot more sort of support from the state versus what is happening in India currently?
So there is, but in the case of DeepSeek, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But I'm saying...
But yes. And so there is a kind of profligacy in the Chinese model that we don't necessarily see because there's a lot of state subsidy. And of course, they do have a lot of deep pockets. The state, the Chinese state is immensely rich and powerful. And this is, in a sense, a problem for the rest of the world because they are subsidizing their innovations and making them highly affordable. In fact, they have this term called involution, which is to indicate that their innovation is on steroids to the point where there is deflation. The price of things is falling. And they export those highly affordable products to the rest of the world, for instance, electric vehicles. And it prices out the local competition. The Europeans, for instance, are suffering from this in a big way. Consumers benefit, but the industry doesn't. So that is the Chinese equivalent.
Model of doing things. Another thing that I found very interesting was, this is in the case of Surabhi, where she says you're dealt certain cards, you can choose what to do with them, and then you say that many religions have contemplated this dilemma. The idea of accepting your circumstances and moving forward with action resonates with Bhagavad Gita's lesson of doing your duty without thinking of the results. And I thought it's interesting because philosophically it's interesting. But in a country like India, does that really work? That you do what you have to without really questioning? I don't know.
So perhaps it's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of creative license there. We are trying to make a connection. So I think, again, we are trying to break out of the bounds of a classic business book. We want this book for people to relate to. And that was actually the the success of the Jugaad innovation book that I wrote with others in 2012 was that it was a kind of a crossover book. It wasn't entirely just about business. We were able to relate to culture. We were able to relate to where India was at that time. And I think we're trying to do that here too. There's an element of trying to tap into the cultural zeitgeist, to look at what is sort of uniquely Indian here. And what is Jugaad and resource constraints and your circumstances got to do with the wider culture and the heritage of India? And I think it does. There is a link to karma. There's a link to your situation, your circumstances.
And making the best of what there is.
So
again, I thought it was interesting because, in the Indian connotation, for many years, Jugaad was not considered a sort of good word. It was always sort of associated with something sneaky, or off late, of course, it's fine, right? Jugaad is sort of very common term and all. But I thought that at a time in India currently where unemployment rates are very high, jobs aren't very much to come by, salaries have stagnated. Is this somewhere the future in terms of encouraging more and more people to become entrepreneurs, to open that up? Is that really the path we're going? But is that something, again, because we kind of hope? Or is it something that become a reality? I don't know.
Fair point. There are a lot of things there. So just on picking up on the Jugaad point. So when we wrote the book Jugaad Innovation in 2012, it was very interesting because people were very split on our use of that term. We got a lot of pushback from, particularly, I would say, older Indians who felt that we were celebrating the worst, what made, the worst aspects of Indian business or the Indian economy and so on. And, there's an element of truth to that, because Jugaad can be used. And our response to it was that it's like any tool, So a knife in the hand of a robber is scary, but in the hand of a surgeon is reassuring. Right? So I think it's true. And actually, even though there were many people who kind of liked the idea of Jugaad, we were celebrating something that was very Indian, and we were also trying to show how it can be used in a good way. Nevertheless, there are criticisms of Jugaad, hence this book. To move from the purely improvisational to something that's much more intentional, to move from something that's short-term to something that's long-term, to try and get around some of the externalities, the negative externalities, the environmental and social costs of Jugaad, pure Jugaad, to something that is more environmentally sort of sustainable. So hence this book. So that's on the Jugaad piece. But then you ask a very interesting question about how sustainable is the economic model in India and elsewhere, frankly, especially with the advent of things like AI.
I was going to come to that.
And, as a business school professor who has students who are going on the job market every year, we notice patterns globally. And the fact is that, the large corporations in the sort of traditional sectors have not been hiring in the way they did before. Yes. The digital giants who are hiring are not hiring in the way they did before. So those traditional jobs that often you would, like consulting jobs, or even the big finance jobs and so on, those jobs are not as easy to come by globally. I think India is still somewhat better off because the economy is still ticking over in a way that most other economies are not. But there is this question of whether we are now facing an inflection point because of these productivity enhancing tools, AI in particular. And if the big established companies are not hiring, then what alternative do you have other than entrepreneurship? And so in a way, this book is also a celebration of that entrepreneurial drive and the opportunity.
So, it's again interesting because when you read about AI and what it's doing and all of that, and the fact is that it's going to take away a lot of these low to mid-level jobs that a lot of people are talking about, like let's say law clerks or whatever, mid-managers, possibly slightly lower level coders. No, and the reason I ask you that in terms of entrepreneurship, because as someone said to me, what AI is not going to take away is the plumber that's coming to your house, right? He's not going to take away the electrician who's going to come and fix your... So it's interesting that is the entrepreneurial economy and journey going that skills route? Skills which, at least in India, I mean, in the West, they are still considered to be, proper professions. But in India, it's fairly menial. We have a large labor force, all of that taken into consideration, plumbers and electricians. But so is that you see happening? Or because AI is not solving issues of, it's not really doing my laundry. Sadly. So...
No, I think that's right. Although there are people who are real, what you might call techno-optimists, but I think that's almost a kind of dystopian view.
Which is the robots coming in and
embodied AI.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of progress being made in embodied AI. Although we see now, because it's not quite there yet, there are lots of these spoof, they show the robot not sure how to put clothes into the, and taking a long time to do what a human will do in seconds. But there is progress on that front as well. Now, I mean, I use AI quite a lot, particularly in my research and so on. And I also have an administrative job in our business school. So I'm also trying to use it to get guidance on how to do our marketing better across our programs and all this kind of stuff. So I find that actually you need the human in the system for those admin jobs. Because, first of all, who's going to give the AI the command and ask it the question? And the way you ask the question matters. Then when the AI comes back with an answer, you have to have the human to be able to interpret and make some sense of it.
Also, it hallucinates quite a bit.
Is this a bogus answer? Because sometimes there are bogus answers. Quite obviously bogus. In some cases, they are quite ingeniously bogus answers. You have to dig a lot to see that it's hallucinating. And then you have to use a judgment, even if it's accurate. You have to use the judgment. Is this going to work? Is this going to be acceptable to other humans in the system? So I don't think it's a trivial thing. I think this is where techno-optimists, and I'm not a techno-optimist in that sense, think that it's just a matter of time and, it's going to happen sooner than they say 27, it's not 26, but 27 it'll happen. I don't think that. My experience suggests that, and this is a line that I've heard some other people say, you won't lose your job to AI. You'll lose your job to someone who can use AI better than you.
Yeah.
And I think that's closer to the truth.
Again, you're a professor. I was watching something the other day, and one of these tech gurus saying that in a few years you won't need teachers anymore.
Yeah.
And I thought, but teaching is not just about teaching. It's about an entire experience. You engage with a person, and how are you expecting AI to do that? And that's very interesting. But you also speak about education and all of that. And again, as a professor of management, how do you see AI in education and that future unfolding?
Yeah, wow, that's such a huge question for us because it's happening while we speak. So at the University of Cambridge, there's so much soul searching, and this is across universities, about what is it that we as educators are offering that's adding value to students. Because what's happening in some places, including at top business schools, is that it's kind of now AI in, AI out. In that, you set a task to the students, say an essay they have to write. They get the AI to write it for them and they submit it. And then the faculty use AI to mark it and give feedback. So where's the value addition there? And who's learning, if at all, right? And why are they paying huge fees for that? They don't need to.
What are the answers?
So this is where there's a lot of experimentation going on. I mean, so some are going back to how it was before there were tablets and iPads and laptops. They're going back to textbooks. They're going back to written exams in a closed book, invigilated context. Now that, there's some things that exams test for, but, there are other things that you need that the exams won't test for, including how do you use AI. So you can't just assess through an exam. You need to do some of that. But then you may need to assess how they use AI and how they make those judgments. What's the human in the loop? So you might explicitly tell them to do something, a piece of work, and then you ask them to use AI to judge their own work and then tell you how they used AI to improve it. Right? So that could be done. Then you might also assess by you give them a task which they perform live to the rest of the class, either individually or in groups. That they might use AI to prepare for, but then they have to present it live and they have to answer questions live.
So as long as sort of they're learning in terms of they can debate and defend what they've presented,
absolutely,
that's good to go.
And I think that is the heart of education, is you teach people how to learn, right? Exactly. And you can use AI in a way that helps you learn better, helps you improve your critical skills. Because after all, I too said, if I'm using AI, I have to be able to judge. I can outsource my thinking to AI, but then what's the point of that? And at some point, it will come back to bite me. So I think this is where it's really forcing us to think about what is the purpose of education and how do we achieve it. And I think you also raised another point, which is, I think there will be in many professions, many industries, many sectors, it'll force us to think about what is the value of the human. What is it that humans can offer uniquely in that service, in that context? And how can the AI or robotization or whatever it is improve their ability to deliver? So if you think about healthcare, just like education, it's a very people-centric thing. And you could take the person completely out of the loop by having AI tell people what they should do, what medication they should take, and so on. But then we lack that human touch. Sometimes you want the reassurance, the trust of somebody, right? Yeah, so I think so that might force us to think about where is the human adding value.
Yeah, and especially, it's like a doctor who's giving you some sort of really bad news or something, and how you expect it?
Yeah, or to the family, things like that. Yeah.
So, okay, I want to end with: was there any story or any founder who didn't make it to the book that you wanted to, but like this interview, like my director's telling me 30 minutes and end, was there? Yeah. Was that, and you felt, oh my God?
Yeah, so lots of people. Okay. And this is partly the challenge, and you raised the question right at the beginning, why only the familiar, many of these are quite familiar. The thing is that I think because India is such a young country still, in terms of the demography, we have so many young people, and many of them, their entrepreneurial, juices have been released. There is so much potential here. There's just so much going on in all kinds of sectors. We mentioned AI, but you can take any sector. Things like in agriculture, there's so much going on with drones and satellite imaging and so on. In healthcare with medical devices, in mobility, and some of it is almost science fiction to think of, young Indians doing this kind of stuff. And so the moment we had literally submitted this, I started to discover more and more. Every day, you just open the newspaper and you hear.
Is there a next one coming out? India Sparks or something?
Great question. So this is the problem in a way with a book, because the day it's published, it's kind of static. But now we have so many media, so what I've been doing with my co-authors is posting on LinkedIn every week a story of another startup, a lean spark startup that we have discovered. And then we ask our readers to send in more examples.
How interesting.
And that's where you keep it.
How interesting. So not just the book, you can follow Professor Prabhu on his LinkedIn to know more about India's startups. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us on DeKoder.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.